Coming up, 21 tips for Adobe Photoshop. Hey everyone, Brady from Texturelabs here. It's been a minute, but I am excited to get back into Photoshop. I'm gonna try to cover a whole lot of grounds here, something for everyone. We're gonna start with 7 easy Photoshop tips, not only for beginners, just things that are easy to implement, 7 intermediate, everyday working tips and techniques, and finally 7 advanced tips, things that are a little bit more conceptually heavy duty, but I think some things you are not gonna wanna miss. Let's get right to it, starting off with something that is guaranteed to give you more detailed results in the program because it's literally a setting hiding in your image processing preferences that allows you to choose detailed results. Now, this applies to automatic subject selection and background removal. These things will take a fraction longer to process, nothing that would really make a difference in your workflow, but take a look at how the default settings clipped out these highlights in the hair, and the more detailed results was able to determine that those were actually part of the subject. I think this is a preference definitely worth switching. Tip number 2, we're going to talk about something in Photoshop that you don't really think about because it's all this nothing, all this empty space out here. What does that have to do with anything? Well, in Adobe Illustrator, we can have reference material or alternates, all kinds of stuff off of the canvas or artboard. In Photoshop, just gray. But give this a shot. Try converting your Photoshop document to an artboard, just a single artboard. Artboards are generally used for having multiple artboards on screen, but just using a single artboard unlocks this option. We can move things off of the canvas and still see them, unlocking all this useful space for reference material or layers you haven't put in place yet. Now, don't be surprised that in the layers panel, your background layer is going to get converted to a regular layer. You'll also see this artboard dropdown, which works like a group folder. This will show you what's on your canvas and what's out in the gray area. All right, tip number 3 is just going to be a friendly reminder to never use the filter gallery halftone filter for creating black and white halftones. You can get a much more authentic halftone by making your image black and white and then using the color halftone filter. The trick is setting these 4 values to all be the same number. And look at this, we get a black and white halftone that's actually made of halftone dots. Look at the difference between the filter gallery and the color halftone filters. Tip number 4 is going to be a very useful little Photoshop command that's only available using a keyboard shortcut. There are a few of these commands you won't find anywhere in the menu, so they don't really have a name. They never become a part of your workflow. So I have all these items on a single layer. If I drag a selection and use Command Shift J, the selection gets cut from the current layer and duplicated to a new layer, effectively splitting this one layer into 2 layers. I think this one's worth memorizing. There are just so many circumstances where you want to split a layer into multiple layers. Tip number 5 is just a single button that after all these years, I only very recently clicked on in Photoshop. Maybe it's just me. If you've got a levels or a curves adjustment layer, look at this. Calculate a more accurate histogram. Click on that and it updates the histogram. Apparently we haven't been looking at the most accurate histogram. I think I'm just going to get in the habit of clicking on this whenever I'm working with curves. Tip number 6, adding a white border. Such a basic thing, but for a long time, when I wanted a white border, I was doing it in lots of clunky ways. So for the record, I just wanted to point this out. We can use the rectangle shape tool to create a white rectangle shape. Then go into the path operations and use this subtract front shape option. That inverts the shape and we have this easy solid that can be moved or adjusted to create just the right border. Tip number 7, our last easy tip. I just want to share with you guys my favorite, very easy vintage color correction adjustment. You may have seen me use this in After Effects. I'll apply a channel mixer adjustment layer. I'm going to navigate to the blue channel and change this so that it gets most of its value from the green channel. So maybe 70% green, 30% blue. That's going to neutralize the yellow tones and push the blues and greens both toward more of a cyan. It works pretty consistently to take your image just a little bit back in time, giving it that bronze and teal color palette. All right, well, we are warmed up here in Photoshop. Let's turn it up a little bit and get into our 7 intermediate Photoshop tips. Tip number 8 is going to be a simple but effective compositing technique. We'll call it the lens flare sandwich because it can be a really nice effect to use light or lens flare elements to separate things from each other or from the backgrounds. But when you put a lens flare behind something, it looks a little weird and fake. It doesn't really make sense for a lens flare to be behind something. So here's the tip. We do use this lens flare behind the layer, but then make a duplicate of it and put this one on top of the layer. And now if I move both of these lens flares around together, we get that nice separation from the background, but we also get some nice light spilling over the top for a more realistic effect, the lens flare sandwich. Tip number 9 is going to focus on an issue that comes up for everyone in Photoshop, cleaning up those pesky artifacts on the edges of clipped out items. Now the impulse here, and most tutorials are going to tell you, to just push the mask further inwards by some means and just get rid of those areas by hiding them. But I really don't like to screw up the original shape of the layer. Instead, I'm going to create that initial mask, then on the layer itself, not on the mask, I'll use the clone tool, find those problem areas, and just with a small soft brush, I'm going to sample the area very near the edge and just clone it outward, copying that clean area over to wherever that little background fringe is. It takes a little bit of extra work, yes, a little bit of manual labor, but about 1 minute to go around this image, and we have a nice clean cutout that works over any background without changing the original contours of the subject. Tip number 10 is going to address the Liquify background problem. So Liquify, awesome filter, lots of cool stuff you could do with it. And you can probably see what I'm trying to do here. I want to liquify these pieces of text to kind of wrap around the background. I've already done one of them, and now I'm trying to liquify this text into place, but it's a little confusing because the background is still showing me the original shape. You can select different background layers, but I really want to see all the layers for context, so it seems like the best you could do here is some kind of weird blend of the background, which is really not ideal. So here's the fix for that. It's a little bit counterintuitive. Pretty much anytime I use Liquify, I'll first bring the opacity of the layer I'm liquifying to 0. Then I can use Liquify. That removes it from the background composite. Now you can liquify a layer on top of an accurate background, hit apply, and then bring the opacity right back up. Tip number 11, while we're at it with Liquify, let's look at something fun and just check out a little option here that you may not have experimented with. It's this tool, Freeze Mask. So you use it to paint in a little mask, and we'll just leave the edges of the letters unmasked. And then we can just get really, really heavy with the regular warp tool. It's going to lock that one area in place, so we can create some really awesome effects just by liquefying this one little piece of the image, but being really heavy-handed with it. By the way, also a cool technique to try with photographic images. Tip number 12, I mentioned this one in a video I did a while back, but I think it's cool enough that I'm going to include it here. It's the blur layer style effect. What do I mean by that? Well, we've got all these drop shadows and glows and things in the layer effects, but what about just a blur effect? Well, it can be done, it just requires the correct combination of settings. We need a drop shadow, and then in the blending options, I need to take the fill opacity for the layer down to 0. So that leaves a hole in the shadow, but back in the drop shadow settings, if you uncheck this little box, layer knocks out drop shadow, we get the full drop shadow or blurry shape. Now the color and the blending mode of this blurry shape is going to be determined in the drop shadow settings. So maybe we could set this to color burn, and we can really create kind of a cool text effect and still have the flexibility to experiment with fonts and preserve our live text. Tip number 13 is going to take the same technique in a totally different direction. We'll use this blur drop shadow to create a glow effect that I think is much more dynamic than the built-in glow effects, because this doesn't have to be a black linear burn shadow. It can just as well be a cyan colored shape set to add mode. We'll make it kind of faint at 25% opacity, and then I'm going to use this little plus icon next to the drop shadow to create a few more drop shadows. Each one is going to be a little bit larger and a little bit brighter. So this one at 50% opacity with a size of 25, another copy at 100% opacity with a size of 125, and yet another one with the size all the way up at 250. 4 copies usually seems to be the magic number, and I think a nice technique for creating some organic color in a glow effect is to use different colors for each one of these instances. So we can just experiment a little bit here. Here the base layer is cyan, then we get a little bit larger orange glow, then some blue glow, and then some purple. And you can create that nice kind of blooming color variation that I think looks a little bit more photographic. So we now have this glowing text effect with live type. Tip number 14, we're getting very close to the advanced tips here, because what we're going to do is take what's probably a rarely used Photoshop filter and look at a very cool use for it. It's the render fibers filter. What's this for? Who needs fibers in their artwork? Well, it can actually give you some really cool graphic elements. Now, pretty much every time I use this effect, I do something like this. First, put a little bit of vertical motion blur on it just to smooth it out just a little. Then put some kind of gradient layer on top at about 50% opacity. And finally, a threshold adjustment. So that's going to create this cool kind of streaky transition from black to white. By adjusting the opacity of the gradient and pushing around the threshold, this can be long streaks or short streaks, lighter or darker. And I find this to be a very useful graphic element. We can grab a little piece and use it to create some motion blur lines, or sort of jet trails behind a plane, or a light beam under a UFO. Things get really cool when you twist and warp this pattern. So we can wave warp the entire thing and it makes these sort of abstract flames. Or check this out. If I use polar coordinates to warp this into a circle, we get this awesome sort of graphic sun type of a shape. This makes a really cool background element. Or let's change up the gradient layer. If I change the gradient to be a mirrored gradient, then we get black to white to black. Warp this into a circle using polar coordinates, and this is a useful little pattern for a light burst or the details of an eye. If I had taken the fibers and turned them sideways before using polar coordinates, we're going to get a different kind of a shape. This can be the spinning propellers on a plane. That's render fibers. Give it a shot. All right, that moves us squarely into advanced territory, but first, can I just zoom out for a second here and show you guys how I created the graphics for this video? Because just a few months ago, I released this plugin, the Texturelabs Distressor panel, which allows you to create and customize this very kind of thing. And the response to this plugin has been insane. These really are just messages in my inbox, which of course have made me very happy to see because I actually love using this plugin just as much myself. I'm using it right here for the graphics in this video. The only difficult part is deciding what direction to take. Does this have an old newsprint look? Does it have a grungy halftone texture? Is it more like stamped ink? Or here I just opted for a nice classic grungy printed look. So I would encourage you to check out the Distressor. Thank you to everyone who has picked up the plugin. It's made the last few months very exciting, and it helps keep the free textures and tutorials and things alive. All right, let's get to those advanced tips. So these are going to be for Photoshop users who are familiar with blend if or even knockout blending, but I think you'll be able to pick up on some cool stuff either way. Starting with tip number 15, which happens to be my favorite tip in this video. We'll call it adjustment layer knockouts. So I love using gradient map adjustment layers in my work, but I often want to use different gradient maps for different parts of an image. But overlapping gradient maps does not work out well at all. So that means masking in the areas you want, but then removing those areas from the other gradient maps. In this game of getting all the masks to add and remove the correct areas, it can be a real mess, especially when you get into having 3 or even more gradient maps. But here's the solution. I'm going to create the first gradient map, and I'm not going to use this mask at all. But this gradient map is going to go into a group folder. In fact, all the gradient maps are going to go into this group folder. So I create the second gradient map with the next setting I want to use. Then I'm going to double click on this layer and set it to knockout shallow. And check this out. I'm going to make the mask black, and then I can paint into this mask. Now, anywhere that this gradient map exists, it's going to punch a hole through or knock out the adjustment layer below it. We can create a third gradient map for some detail color, set it to knockout shallow, and then I'm going to use the mask to paint in the areas that I want. And this one is going to knock out or replace the gradient map layers below it. So whatever gradient map sits on top here is going to be the one that's visible. And this could be awesome for creating not just sharp, clean masks, but also these beautiful blends between gradient maps. So here I have a gradient with these orange and magenta tones, then another gradient map in blue. Since it's set to knockout, the blue has completely hidden the orange. But if I create a soft mask that fades this blue layer out toward the center, we get this beautiful organic transition between the two color treatments. Okay, like I said, advanced Photoshop tips, but don't worry, they won't all be that intense. In fact, let's stick with gradient maps for something a little bit more straightforward. In tip number 16, using a feature I'd always hoped for and was very excited to see introduced into Photoshop. In the gradient map layer methods, it's the stripes method, gradients with no blending between the colors. Now, the display here is a little bit misleading. In the properties panel, this is actually an accurate representation of the gradient map this is creating. So these nice clean cutoffs between the colors, I've created several tutorials where we had to do this manually using posterize and then mapping the gradient to specific values, but this is what I wanted all along. We can get these beautiful graphic thresholds between the colors, move the values around to be right where we want them. So be sure to check out the stripes method. Not too advanced, but we're gonna make it advanced in tip number 17, because with a stripes gradient map or with a threshold adjustment, inevitably the outlines of the shapes never quite look how you imagine they should. You get some lumpy areas, you lose some details. So to fix this, tip number 17 is going to be called threshold smudging. And the idea here is that we're going to use the smudge tool on an image underneath the stripes gradient map or a threshold adjustment layer. And just with a plain soft smudge brush, it works almost like the Liquify filter when it's under these extreme adjustments. So we can really control and refine and customize these shapes very easily to create some sharp details, give it more of a clean, stylized look. Similarly, with just a plain threshold adjustment layer, I'm getting some really messy shapes here, but the smudge tool really does work well to push these shapes into a more clear graphic form and end up with this really clean, almost vector style illustration using threshold smudging. Tip number 18, we've ended up with a pretty cool image here, but let's talk about the one big issue, which is the lack of anti-aliasing on these edges. Now, there's one filter in the program that pretty consistently does, I think, a good job at repairing this. So we're going to want to make a merged copy of all these layers with the mother of all keyboard shortcuts, Command-Option-Shift-E. And to give it more of an anti-aliased look, I'm going to apply the oil paint filter. However, I want these first two values down as low as they can go, sometimes really all the way at the bottom. And we're just taking advantage of the way the oil paint filter tries to interpret the direction of all these lines and shapes and just smooths them out just enough to be more pleasing to the eye. So you never look at this and read oil paint filter, but we've got a nice anti-aliased image. Tip number 19, this is an old school Photoshop technique that even with all the automated features in the program, I think is worth having in your back pocket. This is channel matching with curves. So here's what I'm looking to do. I want to take this image and match the color tone of this image. So to do that, I'm going to apply a curves adjustment and use a clipping mask to target this layer. Then in the channels panel, take a look at the red channel. We're going to go to the red channel of the curves and try to match the brightness and contrast of the two images. I think we need just a little more contrast in the red channel here, but the images are already pretty similar. But next, we're going to switch over to the green channel, where the differences in the skin tones are a little bit more pronounced. So in the green channel of the curves, again, I'm going to try to match that brightness and contrast just by eye. Finally, same thing with the blue channel. The blue channel really brings out the differences in the images, so let's try to get that to match more closely. And then we'll switch back to the full color image and take a look. And I'd say that's a pretty nice match using no automated tools, just using our eyeballs and pushing around the color channels. Tip number 20 is for Photoshop users who, like myself, use a lot of blend if. Possibly the most powerful blending mode in Photoshop, it can be used very effectively to blend items onto a background. However, if you have a lot of layers, it can be a real pain applying blend if to each one, and you're likely to run into problems with overlapping layers. So consider this alternative. Make a copy of your background and move it to the very top, and then apply blend if to this background on top layer. The settings are going to be the exact opposite of what they would have been on the individual layers. So instead of blending the highlights of the underlying layer, we're going to blend out the shadows on the current layer. And this creates the exact same effect as blend if on the individual layers, but this sits on top of everything. It's one layer and you don't get those conflicts with overlapping layers. And we even have an additional level of control here with the opacity of this layer. So the effect can be even more specific. Kind of an interesting concept, just turning the whole project on its head. All right, finally, tip number 21. If tip number 21 makes sense to you, you are an advanced Photoshop user, and this is a really cool way to test out and experiment with masks. We'll call it knockout mask groups. So let's say I have a logo type and I always want to try out a bunch of different grungy mask textures to see what works well, but copy pasting each of these textures into the layer mask just feels a little clunky and 20th century. So I'm actually not going to use a mask at all. Instead, what I'm going to do is drag one of these textures into the document and put it in a group folder. Then I'm going to use blend if on this group. With that Option or Alt drag, I'm going to give it a smooth blend to make the blacks transparent. Then I'm going to group it again, and on this parent group, bring the fill opacity to 0 and set it to knockout shallow. And now, as you can see, this black and white texture is acting as a mask for the layers underneath it. We can put whatever we want in this inner folder, and that will become our mask. We can drop 6 different textures into this group, compare them, switch them on and off. Maybe I want to use levels on one of them or invert another one and find just the right mask. Now this whole piece, this group, we can call it the knockout group, it's going to knock out or mask everything below it until it hits the background. So if I drop something behind this text, it also gets masked out. However, if we want the mask to stop right here, we need to take the knockout group and the target layer and put them into yet another group folder. If this knockout group is contained in a folder, it will stop at the end of that folder. All right, that's it. The challenge I set myself, can I contain 21 tips in 21 minutes and still have them make sense? I did my best. Hopefully you picked up on a few things that might give you a little extra edge in Photoshop. Don't forget to check out the Distressor plugin. I'll include a link to that below. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.